The sun was merciless. It beat down on the sand like a hammer upon iron, each wave of heat blurring the line between earth and sky. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, silent, wide, and waiting. At its center, curled beneath a brittle Joshua tree, lay a girl of 17 with torn lips, swollen eyes, and skin burnt red by the sun's unforgiving glare. Her name was Clara, and she had been left there to die. Her dress, once crisp and modest, was now ragged and clung to her body in heavy folds, stiff with sweat and dust. Her throat was raw, her breath shallow, and the canteen she had once clutched with desperate fingers was bone dry. She had cried all her tears on the first day. By the second, only silence remained. Time didn't pass in minutes or hours. Here it crawled like a snake through the brush, slow and dangerous. The people who had left her there were the only family she'd ever known. Her village sat just beyond the canyon pass, nestled between rocks and river, full of God-fearing men and women who spoke of grace with closed fists and justice with narrow eyes. When the whispers had begun quiet at first, but soon swelling into rumor, Clara had tried to defend herself. She had spoken softly, stood tall, even wept before the elders. But they didn't want explanations. They wanted a scapegoat. A girl accused of indecency was easier to sacrifice than pride. She hadn't even understood the full weight of what they believed she had done. Someone had seen her walking with the merchant's son by the river. That was all it took. A few glances, a hint of a smile, and the rage of a small, frightened town exploded into judgment. Her parents, too afraid to stand against it, watched in silence as she was marched to the village edge with nothing but a jug of water and a blanket. The Reverend had spoken a verseming about sin and cleansing fire. Then the men pushed her toward the desert and turned away. On that first night, Clara had tried to find her way back, but she had wandered too far in the dark, her bare feet bleeding from thorns and sharp rocks. The stars watched, cold and uncaring, as she stumbled and cried and finally collapsed beneath the twisted shadow of the Joshua tree. When morning came, her mouth was coated in sand. The water was gone. So was the strength to stand. Now, on the third day, she lay unmoving. The wind scraped across her cheeks like needles. A lizard crawled over her ankle, then darted away. Her fingers twitched, but barely. Vultures circled in the distance, slow black specks carving rings in the pale blue sky. And still, she waited. For death, for mercy, for something, anything to come. What lingered deepest wasn't the thirst or the pain. It was the betrayal. The way they had looked at her, not with sadness, but with relief, like a burden finally dropped, like her life had never mattered at all. And that absence, that aching vacuum where love should have lived, hollowed her more deeply than any hunger. She thought of her mother's hands, once warm and quick with needlework. She thought of her father's boots outside the door, always caked in mud from the fields. She remembered laughter, hers, soft and shy, drifting from a window, long before the village had decided who she was allowed to be. And now, she was here, in the desert, left for the sun and the silence and the scavengers. But fate, as it sometimes does, was not finished with her story, because far beyond the dunes, out past the last whisper of wind, a man was limping. He bore the weight of wounds fresh and deep and carried the burden of battles lost and kin left behind. He was Apache, a warrior, and he was headed straight toward the place where Clara lay dying, though neither of them knew it yet. The desert, cruel though it seemed, was about to become a place not of death but of meeting, and the girl who had been abandoned was about to be seen for the first time not as a burden, not as a shame, but as something worth saving. Miles away, across the sun-scorched plains and broken ridges of red stone, a lone figure staggered through the desert like a shadow unwilling to fade. His name was Tokuda, and he was no ordinary traveler. He was a war chief of the Apache, known among his people for his silent courage, his unwavering sense of honor, and a will that refused to die. But now, that will was being tested. His left shoulder was torn open from a gunshot, the blood having dried into a crusted patchwork across his chest. His breath came shallow. Every step dragged the pain deeper into his bones. Days earlier, and a small scouting party had encountered a group of cavalrymen on the edge of disputed land. The battle had been sudden and merciless ambush fire under the cover of early dawn. Tokuda fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered. By the time the smoke cleared, he was alone, wounded, and far from the safety of his tribe. With no horse, no food, and only the dagger at his waist, he turned toward the open desert, not out of hope, but because it was the only place left to go. The desert was familiar to him. He had known its secrets since boyhood, the signs of water beneath certain rocks, the paths animals made in the heat of the day, how to track the stars when all else failed. But this time, the desert did not feel like a companion. It pressed in on him like a test, challenging not his skills, but his will to survive. His body screamed to lie down and sleep. But to sleep here was to die. He paused near a crumbling ridge, just before dusk, leaning on a dry branch he'd carved into a crude walking staff. The world swam before him, a blur of orange sky and spinning heat lines. Sweat dripped from his brow and soaked into the ground. He fell to one knee, his breath ragged, then forced himself up again. He could not die here. Not like this. Not with so many things undone. It was then, in that moment of near collapse, that he saw her, a soft shape in the sand, barely distinguishable from the rock and sagebrush. Lying so still, he thought she might be a mirage. His eyes narrowed. He blinked twice. She was there, a girl, her limbs curled inward, hair tangled and dust-caked, her skin blistered from the sun. Something stirred within him, something more than curiosity or concern. He recognized the posture, the stillness, the slow rise and fall of the chest. She was not dead, but dying. For a brief moment, instinct warned him to move on. She was none of his concern. She was white, from the very people who had driven bullets through his shoulder and into the chests of his friends. Helping her could draw danger. Helping her could kill him, but then he saw her hand twitch. It was so small, barely a tremor. But it held a power Dakota could not ignore. In that movement, he saw not an enemy, not a settler's child, but a soul refusing to surrender. She was holding on, just barely, and something ancient stirred in his chest. A story his grandfather once told came back to him, a tale of the desert choosing who lives, and how, and when. The desert never made mistakes. He limped toward her, every step a jolt of agony, and knelt beside her in the dust. Her eyes fluttered open barely. They were wide, frightened, sun-damaged, and hollow. She recoiled slightly, too weak to run, or speak. She didn't know him, couldn't know him. But he offered no threat. Instead, he gently uncorked the small flask he had saved his last few sips of water, and lifted her head. He tipped the water to her lips. At first, she didn't drink. Then instinct took over, and her throat moved in desperate gulps. The water ran down her chin, but she drank as if she hadn't tasted life in days. Dakota said nothing. There were no words needed. Not in that moment. He studied her face as she slipped back into unconsciousness. She was young, too young to be cast out. The marks on her face weren't from travel, they were from neglect, from cruelty. He didn't know what had brought her here, or why she had been left to die. But he did know one thing. He would not leave her. Not now. Not while her lungs still drew breath. She would not be another broken thing in the desert, forgotten by both her people and the world. He was wounded, yes, but he was Apache, and he had strength enough left for two. The sun had dipped low by the time Clara stirred again, casting long shadows that crept across the sand like watchful spirits. Her throat burned, her skin screamed from the touch of wind against blisters, and her bones ached with every breath. But something was different now. She could taste water on her lips, faint, but reland. Her head rested on something softer than rock. She blinked slowly, painfully, and the hazy blur before her began to take shape. A man knelt beside her, silhouetted against the burning sky. His face was dark with soot and blood, his long hair pulled back and tangled with dry leaves. A crude bandage was tied across his shoulder, soaked through with red. His chest rose and fell heavily, but his eyes sharp and amber-like, firelit. Stone were watching her with a strange kind of quiet. No fear, no pity, just observation, like she was a puzzle he was trying to understand. Clara's instinct told her to flinch away, to scramble back or scream, but her body would not respond. She could barely move. Her heart pounded anyway, fast and frightened. She looked up at him as if expecting a blow. No words passed between them. None were needed. In his expression, she saw something far more dangerous than anger or violence. She saw uncertainty. He didn't know who she was. Nor did she know him. But both of them had the unmistakable look of people who had lost too much, too fast. Something inside Clara softened. She stopped trying to understand the moment and simply let it be. Dakota noticed the change in her breathing. She was no longer gasping in fear, but settling into something quieter, cautious trust. He didn't reach for her again. Instead, he reached into the small pouch at his side and took out a piece of dried mesquite root. He placed it near her hand, just within reach, then leaned back against a rock, his wound pressing against the stone with a wince. Clara didn't touch the root at first. Her gaze flickered between his face and the offering. It could have been poison. It could have been nothing. But the man hadn't hurt her. He hadn't shouted or gestured or touched her beyond offering water. In her village, even kind men barked orders at women. This man, this stranger, sat in silence. He gave her space. He waited. With trembling fingers, she dragged the root closer. It tasted bitter and strange, but it soothed the nausea in her belly and softened the sharpness in her throat. When she finished chewing, she looked at him again. For a long time, they simply sat. Two wounded beings. Two remnants of broken stories. The sky began to darken, shifting from gold to violet. The air cooled. Clara tried to speak, but managed only a rasp. Why? Her voice cracked like dry bark, and she coughed. Dakota didn't answer. He tilted his head slightly, but made no move to approach. Instead, he reached into a second pouch and took out a folded square of cloth. Carefully, he dipped it into a tiny bit of remaining water from his flask and passed it to her. Clara's fingers brushed his as she took it. His skin was warm and rough, scarred from years of fighting or surviving, maybe both. Her hands were smaller, fragile, but covered in scrapes from the sharp desert floor. For a moment, Their hands lingered, not holding, just touching. Connection. Recognition. Something unspoken passed between them, something neither could name. Not love, not even trust, just a fragile understanding, like the first spark of a fire, not yet built. Two strangers joined by the fact that no one else had come for them. She dabbed the cloth against her cracked lips and closed her eyes for a moment. The pain was still there, but a thread of warmth wove its way through her chest. She opened them again, looked at him. He gestured vaguely to the west, where the canyons lay, the direction of safety, home, perhaps. Then, without ceremony, he stood very steady and began to gather dried brush and stone, a shelter, a fire ring. He didn't ask her permission. He just acted, as though helping her was not a choice, but a duty. Clara watched him for a long time, unsure whether to be afraid or relieved. But one truth settled like dust inside her. This man had found her. Not the wind, not the villagers, not death, Tim, and now she wasn't alone. By nightfall, the desert had transformed from a furnace into a cold, shadowed plain. The same sand that burned Clara's skin hours earlier now radiated a bone-deep chill. The sky was endless and black, pricked with stars that shimmered like the eyes of unseen spirits. Coyotes howled in the distance. First one, then another, and a breeze whispered through the jagged rocks. Somewhere out there, danger prowled. But in this small circle of light, cast by a fire of carefully stacked twigs and brush, Clara and the wounded Apache chief sat together, bound by quiet necessity. Dakota had worked slowly but with purpose. Despite the gash in his shoulder, he'd built a small windbreak from stones and scavenged branches, creating a kind of cocoon around them. Clara watched him through the flickering light, her body still too weak to move freely, her lips cracked and her legs stiff from days without food. She hadn't spoken since the single word, "why," escaped her throat, and he hadn't answered. But something about the silence between them felt, full, not empty, not threatening. She pulled the blanket he'd given her tighter around her shoulders. It smelled of pine smoke and leather. Beneath it, her ribs throbbed and her stomach turned over from hunger. But she was no longer dying. That much she knew. Her body had begun to fight again to want. Dakota sat across from her, sharpening a stick with the edge of his obsidian knife. His face, calm and unreadable, flickered in and out of shadow with the fire. There were lines at the corners of his eyes, not from age, but from years of watching the world too closely. His wound had stopped bleeding, but Clara knew it needed more than luck to heal. She tried to speak again. This time it came out as a whisper. You saved me." Tokode didn't look up, but he nodded once. A simple gesture. Honest, he was not the kind of man who sought thanks. "I don't understand," she said after a pause, her voice growing stronger. "Why would you care what happens to me?" Now, he did look up. His gaze was not sharp with judgment, nor soft with pity. It was steady like a river that runs deep beneath the surface. "You were left behind," he said slowly, his voice rough from thirst and accented by his native tongue. "So was I." Clara's breath caught. There, in the firelight, two souls who had been cast aside by the world began to recognize the thread tying them together. Exile, betrayal, survival. "I didn't do what they said," she said suddenly, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I wasn't with anyone. They didn't even ask. Just called me unclean. Sent me out like I was cursed." Tokuda listened. He didn't speak right away, and he didn't offer platitudes. Instead, he dropped the sharpened stick into the fire and leaned forward slightly. "People fear what they don't understand," he said. "Sometimes they give that fear a name: witch, traitor, savage, girl." Clara looked at him, startled. By the last word, he shrugged, a faint movement that made his wound twitch. "I have been called all those things. None of them were true." The wind picked up again, and the fire snapped in defiance. Clara pulled the blanket tighter and nodded slowly. "I think I've been afraid my whole life," she whispered, "but now I'm just angry." Takoda met her eyes. "Good," he said. "Anger can keep you alive, but don't let it choose your path." They sat like that for a long while, two broken things, gathering the strength to become whole again. Above them, the moon climbed higher, bathing the sand in silver. Somewhere beyond the fire's reach, an owl cried. Clara leaned back against the rock wall behind her and closed her eyes. She was still weak, still lost, but no longer alone. A man who owed her nothing had chosen to stay. A man wounded by the same world that cast her out now guarded her through the night. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't demand penance or offer salvation. He simply stayed. And in the firelight, among stars and scars, Clara began to understand that sometimes healing doesn't come from answers or justice, but from the quiet presence of someone who refuses to leave. Morning came like a slow breath, gentle, hesitant, and gold-tinted. The desert, stripped of its night shadows, was once again a realm of scorching light and endless space. Clara awoke stiff and sore but alive. Her eyes opened to the sound of rustling. Dakota was already up, standing on a small rise, scanning the horizon with his back straight despite the obvious pain in his shoulder. The fire had burned down to ash, and a coyote's prints circled the camp, but nothing had disturbed them in the night. She sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, and for the first time, she felt the weight of the day ahead. Her body ached from dehydration and starvation, her feet blistered and raw. But the fear that had clung to her like a second skin had begun to peel away. She was not dead, and she was not alone. Tokuda turned toward her, his expression unreadable. In the harsh light, his face looked older than it had by firelight. His wound had seeped through the bandage again, and yet he moved like a man with purpose. Clara wondered how he did it, how he kept going, even when his body was falling apart. He tossed her a small satchel he had fashioned out of a hide pouch and cactus fiber. Inside were a few strips of dried meat, some prickly pear fruit, and a water bladder fashioned from the lining of a gourd. Not much, but enough, but enough. Clara blinked at the offering. You didn't eat last night, he shrugged. You needed it more. She chewed the meat slowly, grateful for every bite, even though her stomach rebelled against it at first. As she ate, Tokuda crouched beside a rock, sketching something into the sand with a twig. Clara moved closer and saw it was a rough map, drawn from memory, marked with dots, ridges, and arrows. He pointed to one spot. Here, water, 2 days. She nodded, though her body felt like it would never last 2 hours. But Tokuda had already decided they would not stay in the desert. They would not die here. The journey began under a blistering sun. Clara leaned heavily on a walking stick Tokuda had carved from mesquite wood. Every step was a battle. The soles of her feet were cracked and torn, and the blanket wrapped around her shoulders felt heavier with every hour. But she didn't complain. How could she, when the man beside her walked with a bullet wound, still fresh in his flesh? They moved slowly, cutting through narrow rock passes and walking in the shadows of tall ridges where the sun could not reach. Tokuda led the way, stopping often to test the wind, study tracks, or listen to the silence. He was a man of few words, but everything about him spoke of deep knowledge of this land, of survival, of watching closely, and acting wisely. At one point, Clara collapsed, her legs buckled and she crumpled into the sand, her vision swimming. With heat, Tokuda was beside her in an instant, his hand on her back, his other bracing her shoulder. She thought he might scold her, tell her to push through, but he didn't. He waited, let her breathe, let her cry. And then, after she wiped her face and tried to rise, he offered his arm. She hesitated before taking it. But when she did, his grip was firm and steady. He pulled her up with surprising gentleness, as if she were something precious, not broken or weak, but worth protecting. They continued. Along the way, they found a stream hidden beneath layers of rock and silt. Tokuda dug it free with his hands, and let the water bubble up into a small pool. Clara drank until her belly hurt, then laughed soft and surprised. It was the first time she had laughed in weeks, and Tokuda turned toward her with something close to a smile, as night fell again. They made camp beneath a curved overhang, shielded from the wind. Clara helped build the fire this time, mimicking what she had seen Tokuda do the night before. He didn't correct her or take over. He simply watched and nodded. Later, as she lay beside the fire, she whispered, "Why are you helping me?" Tokuda stared up at the stars. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, finally, because someone once helped me. Clara didn't ask more. She didn't need to. In that single sentence, she understood that he had known loss, too. That someone, somewhere, had once chosen mercy over judgment. And now, he was choosing the same. They were no longer strangers. They were travelers on the same path, battered by different storms, but walking together. And somehow, that made the road ahead seem possible. By the third day of their journey, the silence between Clara and Tokuda had become something sacred. It was no longer awkward or heavy. With suspicion, it had become a kind of quiet language. He would glance at the sky, and she would know too. Resty would pause by a strange plant, and he would explain its use with a few words or a nod. Though their mouths remained mostly still, their hearts had begun to speak more clearly. And just as the pain in their bodies slowly dulled, so, too, did the fear in their minds. But peace in the desert was always temporary. That afternoon, the wind changed. Tokuda tensed as they entered a narrow pass, flanked by crumbling cliffs. The heat had reached its cruelest peak, and vultures circled high above, lazy and patient. Tokuda crouched suddenly and motioned Clara down. She obeyed without hesitation, dropping to the sand beside him, heart thudding in her ears. He pointed to faint tracks, boot prints, too narrow and deep to belong to Apache warriors, white men, ranchers maybe, or worse, scout soldiers from one of the roaming patrols known for shooting first and asking later. Clara's stomach knotted. She knew what those men would do if they found her with an Apache. It didn't matter if Tokuda had saved her life. It didn't matter if he had treated her with more dignity than anyone from her village ever had. To them, he was the enemy, a pelt, savage, and any woman with him, well, they'd assume the worst. Tokuda's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before, had watched it unfold from behind cover while bullets split trees and tore men apart. There was no room for mercy in their world, only the quick and the dead. He motioned for Clara to follow him down a side crevice, barely wide enough for one body to pass. They moved in silence, the only sound the scraping of boots against stone. Sweat rolled down Clara's back, and her legs trembled with each step. She clung to the stone for balance, watching Tokota's broad shoulders ahead of her. His every movement careful, controlled. The crevice widened into a shaded hollow, hidden from the trail above. There, they waited. Minutes passed like hours. The sun shifted slightly, casting golden beams across the ridge. Then voices, English, male, casual but alert. Thought I saw smoke. Over this way. Clara's blood turned cold. She and Tokota flattened against the rock, barely breathing. She could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. A part of her wanted to shout, to beg for mercy, for recognition, but she knew better. Those men didn't see girls like her as human anymore, and they sure wouldn't hesitate to shoot an Apache already bleeding from the shoulder. One of the men passed close enough for Clara to smell the dust on his boots. A shadow fell across her outstretched hand, and she pulled it back with a silent gasp. Tokota reached out, gently resting his hand over hers. Not to silence her, but to steady her. The touch grounded her, reminded her that she wasn't just a hunted animal. She was alive. She had survived, and the man at her side had not left. The soldiers moved on, the sound of their boots fading into the canyon wind. Clara didn't move until Tokota did. When he finally relaxed, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They're gone, she whispered. He nodded. For now. She leaned her head against the rock wall, eyes closed. I thought maybe they'd help me. A few days ago, I might have run to them. Tokota looked at her. Would they have listened? Clara paused. No, she said softly. They would have looked at you and seen a threat. Looked at me and seen shame. He didn't respond, but his eyes held something close to understanding. A shared awareness that the world judged not by truth, but by assumption. By skin, by scars, by silence. They sat in that hollow until the shadows stretched long again. The fear had not vanished. It clung to their bones like the dry heat, but it no longer controlled them. Clara had faced death before, so had Tokota, but now they had each other, and the desert, cruel as it was, had begun to teach them both something powerful, that sometimes the greatest threat wasn't the enemy with a gun but the assumptions we carry in our hearts. And sometimes, just sometimes, survival was about more than living. It was about seeing someone clearly and choosing not to run. They walked in silence again the next morning, not from fear this time, but from exhaustion. The events of the previous day, the near encounter with armed men, the long detour through the narrow pass, had drained Clara more than she cared to admit. Her legs burned, her throat ached, and her lips cracked each time she tried to smile. But even so, she kept moving. Because Tokota moved. Because the desert didn't stop for grief or weariness, and neither could they. The land began to change subtly around them. The red rock formations faded into flatter terrain, where scrub brush and mesquite trees dotted the earth like fading memories. The sun was still merciless, but the wind carried the scent of something Clara hadn't noticed before: wood smoke. Faint, but distinct. Tokota noticed it too. His posture stiffened slightly, and he veered off the path they'd been following, heading eastward through a cluster of low hills. Clara followed, confused but trusting. When they crested a ridge, she saw what had drawn him: blackened wood, broken stones, and a ring of charred earth. It was what remained of a village. Her breath caught. What happened here? Tokota said nothing at first. He walked forward slowly, as if the air itself carried weight. He stepped into the center of the ruined settlement and knelt beside a pile of ash that had once been a home. Clara stayed behind, watching as he sifted through the debris with reverent hands. This was mine, he said quietly. Clara approached, her steps careful. She saw, now, the signs of deliberate destruction. Burned shelters, crushed pottery, footprints, frozen and hardened earth, the violence of violence and panic. She could almost hear the screams echoing in the emptiness. Soldiers, she asked. He nodded. 2 seasons ago. We were warned too late. Some escaped, most didn't. She stood beside him, unsure what to say. The weight of it settled into her chest. She looked at the charred ground and thought about how easy it was for people to destroy what they didn't understand. I'm sorry, she whispered. Tokota didn't respond. He brushed dust from the edge of a stone mortar and placed it upright again, almost ceremoniously. Then, wordlessly, he walked to a low ledge where the ground had been cleared. A grave. Several, in fact. Clara followed, heart tight in her chest. She was here, he said, his voice cracking for the first time. My sister, my nephew, others. His hand hovered over the disturbed dirt. I buried them myself. Clara knelt beside him. Tokota, I came back after they were gone. He continued. I was on a hunting trail when the soldiers came, found the fire still smoldering when I returned. I thought I would die here too, but you didn't. No, I didn't. He looked at her now, his gaze fierce and sad. I thought surviving was the punishment, that if I had died, I'd be with them. But now, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Clara felt her own tears come then, sudden and sharp. Not just for Tokota, but for everything she had lost. Her innocence. Her place in the world. The people who should have stood by her and didn't. She understood him in a way she hadn't. before understood how grief carves a person hollow and how survival fills that space with guilt instead of peace. They sat beside the graves as the wind blew soft and mournful. Clara reached for his hand and held it, not as a child needing comfort, but as an equal, a fellow survivor, a human being who had seen the worst the world could offer and chose not to become it. "What do we do now?" she asked. Dakota looked out at the desert, the land that had taken so much and yet remained their only path forward. "We keep walking," he said, "but we carry them with us." He rose then, slow and deliberate, and placed a single carved stone on one of the graves. Clara did the same, finding a piece of smoothed obsidian and laying it gently on another. There were no prayers spoken, no rituals or hymns, but it was a burial of a different kind of anger, of hopelessness, of being alone, that as they turned to leave, Clara realized something she hadn't before. This journey wasn't just about escape or survival. It was about witnessing, about remembering, about choosing life, not just breath, but meaning. As they walked on, the ruins behind them faded into the haze. But the memory remained, and in her heart, Clara vowed she would never let the world forget what had been taken. Nor would she forget the man who had lost everything and still chose to save her. By the time they reached the place Dakota called safe, the sky had turned the soft shade of dusk pale rose, blending into amber and indigo. The journey had spanned nearly a week, though time had lost its structure somewhere between survival and silence. Clara had stopped counting days. Each sunrise felt like a small miracle, and each evening they survived was its own quiet victory. They stood now on the edge of a hidden valley. It was unlike the harsh desert behind them, lush, by comparison, nestled between cliffs that shielded it from wandering eyes. A stream glistened through its center, and cottonwood trees swayed with the breeze. The air smelled of sage and wild mint. Rabbits darted between brush, and birdsong filled the spaces between leaves. To Clara, it looked like the kind of place that belonged in dreams, or memories of childhood of hers had ever held gentleness. Dakota exhaled slowly, as if laying down a burden that had been sitting on his back too long. "This is where I come to heal," he said. Clara didn't answer. She simply stepped forward, letting the silence wrap around her like a warm blanket. The quiet here wasn't empty, it was whole. It had depth. After the chaos of her exile, the cold edge of fear, and the scorching cruelty of the desert, this place felt impossibly soft. They made camp beneath a low bluff. Dakota showed her how to weave brush into a shelter. Together, they caught fish from the stream and roasted them over a clean fire. For the first time, Clara ate without panic clawing at her chest. Her hands didn't shake when she reached for the food. Her stomach didn't protest. She was becoming herself again, not just a shadow trailing death, but someone alive in her own body. After they ate, Dakota sat cross-legged near the fire, sharpening a new arrowhead. Clara watched him for a long while, studying the slope of his shoulders, the way his eyes followed the edge of the stone. Then she said, quietly, "What will you do now?" He didn't answer right away. Finally he said, "I don't know. The people I protected are gone. The land I knew has been burned. But this place, it still listens." She nodded, slowly. "I don't have anyone either. The people who left me, they were supposed to be family. But they didn't ask, they didn't care, they just wanted me gone." Dakota looked up. "You were innocent. So were your sister. Your nephew." He gave a small nod, accepting the truth but not softening under it. Maybe the world is wrong about what it calls scenes. They fell into silence again. But it wasn't heavy, it was reflective, a silence that allowed space for rebirth. Later that night, Clara walked down to the stream alone. She knelt and looked at her reflection in the water, sunburned, hair tangled, dirt across her cheeks, but her eyes were clearer than they had been in years. There was a strength now that didn't come from defiance, but from endurance. She cupped her hands and splashed water across her face. Then, without knowing why, she whispered aloud, "Thank you, not to any god, not to any man, just to the land, to the night, to whatever had refused to let her die alone." Behind her, Dakota's voice came gently. "This is your place now too, if you want it." She turned to find him leaning against a tree, arms folded. "You saved me," she said. He shook his head. "You kept walking." Clara smiled. It was faint, but real. "Then maybe we saved each other." They stayed in the valley for several days. They repaired the shelter, hunted, told stories in slow, cautious words. Clara learned how to read the wind, how to find roots that healed. Dakota laughed once, a short, surprised sound that made her grin like a child. She taught him how to stitch torn cloth, and he gave her a name in his language, Elan, which meant clear spirit after a storm. When it came time to decide what came next, they did so together. They would not return to the towns that cast them out. They would not live among the ruins of the past. They would build a new place, a quiet home tucked between the cliffs, where the forgotten could become whole, and where the wounded could become more than what broke them. And so, in the heart of a desert that had once tried to kill them both, a new life began. Not a rescue, not a return, but a rebirth.